And the word Baal means husband. They got a new husband. He was just a good imitation. He never said no to the quote bride that wanted immediate gratification. She didn't want to deal with impulse control or delayed gratification one bit, so she took a new husband called Baal, you see? And that's what the church is doing now.
In contrast to the view of world with fundamental truths, postmodernism poses a world of contradiction and instability, with no grand theme of meanings or universals. The truths of the past are seen as constructions of those in political power. What seems to be true to the master might not seem to be true to the slave. What seems to be true to a man might not seem true to a woman. What seems true to a heterosexual might not seem true to a homosexual. For centuries, the world was dominated by Eurocentric, white, male, heterosexual establishment that excluded and invalidated the perspective of groups outside the power structure, which it defined as other. Today, we realize that the cultural dominance of some groups can lead to the exploitation and even obligation of others. Postmodernism has invited those whose views were not included in the old world order to construct their own histories, philosophies, and art form, and has considered all constructions of equal validity.
A lot of times the church doesn't see that it is getting its views from osmosis, from what's kind of, they're soaking in the culture and not really knowing it. They're hearing the arguments about, what should be validated, or what should we be, cultural sensitivity training. They go to work, they go and go to training as to, how to have a worldview and stuff like that. And the value system that is in the worldview comes in through people that are a part of the church. And so you get a lot of discussion, within the church as to the possibility of like, hey, loving relationships. How can we condemn same-sex loving relationships? I've seen a lot of non-quote loving relationships that are opposite sex, that are toxic, that are abusive, that are terrible. But I see a lot of love and respect and intelligence and deferment to one another's, preferences, and a lot of honor and a lot of reasonableness and, a lot of communication happening in a same-sex relationship that I don't see. How can you say that this one is right and this one is wrong? This one, though it's same-sex, has love in it. This other one has bitterness and resentment and, and nobody's happy. How can you say just because it's male and female it's right and the fact that it's the same sex is wrong? That type of a thing. And so those kinds of discussions happen built upon those premises all the time. They happen within churches and they happen within memberships of churches. So what starts to happen is that there is this ever adjusting to the concepts that are in the subjective climate of the postmodern concepts. Why am I saying postmodern? Modernism was just something that was coined by Catholicism, talking about everything was built upon standards and measurements. Everything was mechanical. Everything was factory mentality and manufacturing mentality. And modern was something that was all mechanized. Everything was mechanized according to measures and mechanization and stuff like that. And then society moved from a mechanized society, about being productive and gaining material things, and that's called the modern world, right? To a postmodern world, which is, the 60s, where you get into feelings and an inner journey and, and all of this. But in reality, it's just using language to try to create this sense that there's a linear shift or evolution of society when it's in reality cycles, you see. Because even back prior to the medieval period was a period of very solid realism, like normal, realistic kind of stuff. And then they got into mysticism or ideas of intuition or of collective mind, what they called the nous, N-O-U-S, where you get the word news from, where we all collectively have one thought, one mind, and the higher good isn't whether or not we have an objective scale of good and evil, but what is good for the society at that time. Well, that's medieval thinking and that's postmodern thinking. Well, what's good for the society at that time? That's the higher good. And they turn the society into a god, and that's the Hegelian dialectic. And that is many other ideas. That is Augustine and the City of God, and he's taken from Plato. So society becomes the god. And quote, what is good for the society? Well, that goes all the way back to Babylon. The Babylonian society was virtually the concept of the kingdom of the gods here upon this earth. But looking at it from a Christian point of view, Babylon is a picture of Satan creating his dominion here on earth. And everything is subjective. What is for the good of his children or for the promulgation of his society? It's the children of the earth. The ever shifting, going by feelings and intuition as if that's a trustworthy thing. Well, within the church, that kind of thinking has become the conventional thinking now. They validate terms like, quote, postmodernism, and we have to now evangelize the postmodern mind. Therefore, we have to shift and adjust ourselves as to the worldview of the postmodern in this way. So, unfortunately, they don't want to take out anything that sounds like anything the prophets would say. The prophets went and shattered people's perceptions. The prophets of Baal were prophets telling very beautiful stories, love stories. They were the Mithras, very close to Christ. It had a Christ-likeness, but that's where Santa Claus came from. That's where the Easter Bunny literally came from. These things. That's where these fairy tales and fantasies that were well-pleasing, these children's tales, these stories and these tales, and those were the prophets of Baal. And it sounded close enough to truth that the children of God, the people of God, literally said, we want the prophets of Baal. And the word Baal means husband. They got a new husband. He was just a good imitation. He never said no to the quote bride that wanted immediate gratification. She didn't want to deal with impulse control or delayed gratification one bit, so she took a new husband called Baal. You see? And that's what the church is doing now. It's just as seductive now. No one wants to hear the law and no one wants to hear the prophets, but also the scripture says, if you take away the law and the prophets, you don't get the Spirit of God. He doesn't dwell with us. Prophets shatter those paradigms. Prophets come in and tell you exactly what you don't want to hear. You know, like the prophet Micah, going to that king, and he's all saying, I don't want to hear from him because he's never going to tell me what I want to hear. And so he goes to him and says, tell me, what is the Lord telling you? And then he tells him something he doesn't want to hear. It says, I know you're not telling me the truth. You never tell me what I want to hear. He says, you're right. That's not what God is saying. God is saying it's not going to work out for you. You're living a lie. You're living in an illusion. You're deluding yourself and you're ruining everyone who's coming under the pall of your influence. Where are those voices now? Because God is the God of infinite objective truth. And at one point he says, all are going to have to contend with him. At some point, this weird dream that we're living, the self-delusion, the purple haze that we're living in, these strange mystical castles that are minds and in this false reality we tell ourselves that we're living, it's going to come to a screeching halt. It's going to be exposed in a giant cold rain. And God's going to show up at the end of that thing and saying, where are you? And we are going to have to face the fact that we have clothed ourselves, we have made lies our refuge. And God says, even if you go and make the grave the place you hide, you can't hide. I will bring you back from the grave. And the covenant that you made with Sheol will be annulled. You see, we have to hear this stuff now and not when we're facing the judgment after the 1,000-year millennium and we're looking at God and we have no salvation. We have no hope. That's why we're doing these talk videos. These talk videos is to hopefully get into your world, get into your brain, and make those real decisions and to come out of this very, very temperamental, pampered, telling everyone not to judge you, but you run around judging everyone else, hypocrisy that you live in, to not live in that anymore. To run around and prescribing everyone in your world and the world around you, or basically insulating yourself and creating this false reality that is a huge ambition for the postmodern world right now, to come out of that mentality before you find out that it will be the greatest regret of your life to do that. And that's the only purpose for doing this stuff, to go back to the Word of God, where He says stuff like, hey, listen, everything, listen, this is in the book of Acts, it's very powerful. For in Him we live, move, and have our being. Colossians 1:17. And He is before all things, and in Him all things consist. These are really powerful realities. We should quit asking whether or not God exists and go back to the scriptures, like the book of James says, and says, we're but vapor. That's what it says. And it says, God already knows He exists. He broke into our little reality with His word, and He says, I exist. You've got to figure out whether or not you exist. We build things and we heap up treasures and we pile things around us that He says will be thrown to the bats and to the moles at the end. It will mean nothing. And you, somewhere inside of your soul, knows that this is true. But to chase away the boogeyman and saying, I don't want to hear this stuff, I want to live in my delusion, I'd rather charge up my spiritual credit card to max and then hope that one day I don't have to ever face the bill, is not going to happen. The bill comes. And the creditor comes. They always come. And it doesn't matter if you're listening to pseudo-waking up speakers like people like Alan Watts or Terence McKenna or anything else, because they actually teach a God that is an ever-shifting, ontological, shifting God, and collectively your God, individually your God, and society is God, and you're already a God, and the only problem with you is you haven't woken up to the God in you. You better come out of that lie too, because God is very much an objective reality. You will have to face Him. That's why there is such thing as an accountability. And I'm not trying to terrify you for the sake of terrifying you. I'm trying to get you to come out of a dream before that day that the dream is rudely disrupted, but you have no hope. This is the day of hope. This is God moving upon a person to talk to you and to try to reach you through a camera lens, and to say that this is the time to wake up. This is the day that you need to make decisions that you will never have a regret for. And this is the valley of decision you need to find yourself in and not lose yourself from. Make the decision to face these realities. Now is the right time to do that. Is the right